I am Anastasia, and I never imagined that a single phone call from my brother-in-law would destroy everything I'd spent 5 years building. But before I tell you how Derek manipulated his way into stealing my life savings and nearly destroyed my boutique empire, let me know where you're watching from and hit subscribe. You'll want to see how this ends. Growing up, I was always the one with fabric scraps scattered across my bedroom floor and a head full of designs that nobody else seemed to understand. While my sister Bethany was dating the captain of the football team, and my brother Marcus was getting recruited for college baseball, I was hunched over my grandmother's old Singer sewing machine, teaching myself to create something beautiful from nothing. My parents meant well, but they never quite knew what to make of me. Anastasia's got her little hobby, my mother would say to visitors, gesturing toward whatever garment I was working on. She's very creative. The pause before creative always stung, like it was a consolation prize for not being traditionally successful like my siblings. But I had vision. Even at 17, sketching designs in the margins of my chemistry notebooks, I could see it clearly. A boutique that would make every woman feel like the best version of herself. Not the cookie-cutter fast fashion that filled the malls, but pieces with character, with story, with soul. Clothes that whispered confidence instead of screaming desperation. College was supposed to cure me of these unrealistic dreams, according to my father. He pushed me toward business administration, thinking it would channel my creativity into something practical. Little did he know that every marketing class, every accounting lesson, every supply chain management seminar was actually feeding my real plan. While my classmates saw dry theory, I saw the blueprint for my future empire. Bethany was the only one who truly believed in me back then. 2 years older in everything I wasn't. Blonde where I was brunette, outgoing where I was introspective, effortlessly popular where I was determinedly different. She used to sneak into my room after family dinners where my parents would go on about Marcus's baseball prospects or her latest academic achievement, and she'd sit cross-legged on my bed, running her fingers over my latest creations. "You're going to be famous someday, Marley," she'd whisper, using the nickname only she was allowed to call me. "These are incredible. You see things differently than everyone else." When Bethany started dating Derek during her senior year, I was cautiously optimistic. He seemed charming enough, tall, confident, with an easy smile, and the kind of smooth talking that made my parents light up at family gatherings. He worked in finance, drove a nice car, and had what my father called real potential. Most importantly, he made Bethany happy. At least that's what I thought at the time. Derek had this way of dominating conversations that initially seemed impressive. He'd walk into a room and somehow become the center of it within minutes, regaling everyone with stories about his latest deals, his investment strategies, his 5-year plan for early retirement. My parents ate it up. Here was someone who spoke their language of financial security and conventional success. But I noticed things. The way his compliments to Bethany always came with tiny barbs. "You look beautiful tonight, babe, but you might want to touch up your lipstick." The way he'd interrupt her mid-sentence to clarify what she really meant. The way her laugh became more forced, more careful around him. When they got engaged 6 months later, I pushed down my concerns. Bethany seemed happy, and maybe I was just being overprotective. After all, what did I know about relationships? I was too busy building my secret world of fabric samples and business plans to focus on dating. The wedding was beautiful. Derek insisted on paying for everything, which impressed my parents even more. As I watched Bethany walk down the aisle in the custom gown I'd secretly designed for her, I made myself believe that my worries were unfounded. She was radiant, and Derek looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. If only I had trusted my instincts then. If only I had seen the manipulation already beginning to weave its web around all of us. The first time I realized something was seriously wrong was 3 months after the wedding, when Bethany showed up at my apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She stood in my doorway in wrinkled pajamas and flip-flops, her eyes red-rimmed and her usual perfect composure completely shattered. "Can I stay here tonight?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Derek and I had a fight." I pulled her inside immediately, wrapping her in one of my oversized cardigans and making chamomile tea, while she curled up on my couch like a wounded animal. When I asked what happened, she just shook her head and mumbled something about a misunderstanding about money. "He thinks I spend too much," she said, staring into her mug. "He's probably right. I bought groceries without checking with him first, and apparently we had already budgeted for the week. I should have known better." The way she said it, like she was reciting a lesson she'd been taught, made my stomach clench. This wasn't the confident sister who used to sneak out to midnight movies with me and talk back to our father when he was being unreasonable. This was someone who had learned to make herself smaller. But by morning, she was back to her normal self, laughing off my concerns and insisting that all couples had adjustment periods. "You know how Derek is about organization," she said, applying concealer under her eyes with practiced efficiency. "He's just trying to help us save for our future. It's actually sweet, when you think about it." I wanted to argue, but Derek arrived to pick her up before I could find the words. He apologized profusely for our little spat, bringing flowers and speaking to me with the kind of casual charm that made me question my own perceptions. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe this was just what marriage looked like: compromise and adjustment, and learning to blend two different approaches to life. Over the following months, the pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency. Bethany would call or text with increasingly elaborate excuses for why she couldn't make our weekly sister dinners. Derek needed her to attend a work function. Derek had planned a surprise weekend getaway. Derek thought it would be better if they spent more time together as a couple before expanding their social circle. When we did manage to see each other, it was always with Derek present, and the dynamic was unmistakable. He answered questions directed at her, corrected her stories, and somehow managed to steer every conversation back to his own achievements and insights. Bethany would sit beside him with a fixed smile, nodding at appropriate intervals, her personality dimming like a light with a dying bulb. The most disturbing part was how he started treating me. At first, Derek had been politely dismissive of my little sewing hobby, the same way our parents were. But as months passed, and I started sharing small hints about my growing business, carefully, because I wasn't ready to reveal the full scope of what I was building, his attitude shifted to something more predatory. Anastasia's got quite the entrepreneurial spirit, he'd tell people at family gatherings, his tone suggesting this was mildly amusing rather than genuinely impressive. Always working on some new project, very ambitious. He started asking pointed questions about my finances, disguised as brotherly concern. How was I affording my apartment on a part-time income? Was I being smart about saving for retirement? Did I have proper insurance coverage for my business activities? The way he said it made my work sound like a child's lemonade stand rather than the carefully planned venture I was actually building. But it was the way he looked at me during these conversations that really unsettled me. His eyes would narrow slightly, like he was calculating something, measuring the distance between where I was and where he thought I should be. There was a hunger there that I couldn't quite name, but it made me instinctively protective of the details of my success. Bethany seemed oblivious to these undercurrents, or maybe she had learned not to see them. When I tried to bring up my concerns about Derek's controlling behavior, she would deflect with practiced ease. "He's just protective," she'd say. "You don't understand what it's like to have someone care about you that much." The implications stung, that my single status somehow disqualified me from understanding love or partnership. But more than that, it scared me, because the sister I'd grown up with would never have used my insecurities as a weapon. Derek was changing her, molding her into someone who would defend his control even when it hurt the people she loved most. I should have fought harder then. I should have found a way to break through the walls he was building around her. Instead, I threw myself deeper into my work, telling myself that success would be the best way to prove that I didn't need anyone's protection or approval. What Derek didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my little hobby had quietly grown into something extraordinary. While he was busy lecturing me about financial responsibility and my parents were dropping hints about more stable career paths, I was building an empire from my spare bedroom. It started almost by accident. I'd been making custom pieces for a few friends from college, charging barely enough to cover materials because I was more interested in perfecting my craft than turning a profit. But when my friend Cassie wore one of my dresses to her company's holiday party, everything changed. The dress was a deep emerald silk with hand-sewn beading along the neckline. Nothing flashy, but elegant in a way that made the wearer feel powerful rather than precious. Cassie later told me that 3 different women asked her where she'd gotten it, and by the end of the week I had my first real commission. That client led to another, then another. Word spread through a network I hadn't even known existed. Professional women who were tired of choosing between frumpy, work-appropriate clothes and overtly sexy pieces that made them feel like they were playing dress-up. They wanted sophistication with personality, quality without pretension, clothes that whispered confidence instead of screaming for attention. I started small, working nights and weekends while maintaining my day job at a marketing firm. Every spare dollar went back into the business. Better fabric, professional-grade equipment, a proper workspace in the corner of my apartment. I taught myself pattern making from YouTube videos and library books, studied fashion history during my lunch breaks, and spent entire weekends perfecting techniques that most people learned in expensive design schools. The breakthrough came when I created an Instagram account for my work. I'd been hesitant about social media. It felt too much like bragging, too much like asking for validation I wasn't sure I deserved. But Cassie convinced me that hiding my talent was a disservice to the women who needed what I was creating. Within 6 months I had 2,000 followers. Within a year it was 10,000. My designs were being featured in fashion blogs, and I was getting orders from women across the country who had never seen my work in person but trusted the quality based on my reputation. The hardest part was keeping it secret from my family. Every family dinner became an exercise in deflection and understatement. When my mother asked how my sewing was going, I'd mention that I'd completed a few projects while secretly fulfilling orders worth thousands of dollars. When my father suggested I look into more practical career options, I'd nod thoughtfully while calculating the profit margins on my latest collection. Derek was the most persistent in his questioning, always probing with that calculating look in his eyes. "How's the little business venture going, Anastasia?" he'd ask with a patronizing smile. "Making any real money yet, or is it still more of a creative outlet?" I learned to give him just enough information to satisfy his curiosity without revealing the true scope of what I was building. "Oh, covering my costs mostly," I'd say with a self-deprecating laugh. "It's really just for fun." The truth was, by the end of my second year, I was making more money than Derek was in his finance job. I'd left my marketing position and was working full-time on the boutique, with a waiting list of clients that stretched 3 months out. I'd moved to a larger apartment with a dedicated studio space, and I was planning to hire my first employee. I kept detailed records of everything, not just for tax purposes, but because I couldn't quite believe it was real. Spreadsheets tracking orders, profit margins, client retention rates, bank statements showing steady growth month after month, photos of my designs being worn by women who looked radiant and confident, exactly the way I'd always imagined. The most satisfying part wasn't the money, though that financial independence felt like a shield against my family's expectations. It was the messages I received from clients. Women telling me that wearing my designs made them feel like the best version of themselves. Mothers saying they felt beautiful and professional at their daughters' school events. Recent divorcees finding confidence in clothes that fit their new lives. I was creating more than clothing. I was crafting armor for women who needed to feel powerful in a world that constantly tried to diminish them. Every stitch was intentional. Every design choice meant to elevate rather than constrain. But I couldn't share any of this with the people who mattered most to me. Derek's dismissive attitude had infected my entire family's perception of my work, and I'd learned that success shared prematurely became success diminished. So I kept building in secret, telling myself that someday I'd reveal the truth when I was too successful to ignore. I had no idea that Derek was already calculating how to take it all away from me. The first request came on a rainy Thursday evening in March, disguised as a casual family dinner at Derek and Bethany's new house. They'd bought it 6 months earlier, a sprawling colonial in an upscale neighborhood that seemed designed more to impress visitors than to create a home. Derek had insisted on giving me the full tour, pointing out every upgrade and amenity with the pride of someone who needed external validation for every purchase. "The mortgage is aggressive," he confided as we stood in his home office, surrounded by awards and certificates that proclaimed his expertise in financial management. "But that's how you build real wealth, Anastasia. You've got to be willing to take calculated risks." Bethany was in the kitchen, preparing what she called Derek's favorite meal, though I couldn't remember her ever making lamb before she married him. She seemed nervous, checking and rechecking the temperature of the meat, adjusting place settings that were already perfect. When I offered to help, she waved me away with a distracted smile. "Derek likes everything to be just right when we have guests," she said, as if I were a stranger rather than her sister. "He's been looking forward to this dinner all week." During the meal, Derek was unusually attentive to me, asking detailed questions about my work, with what seemed like genuine interest. How was my client base growing? Was I planning to expand? Did I ever think about taking on investors or partners? His questions felt more sophisticated than his usual patronizing comments, and I found myself sharing more than I'd intended. "You know, Anastasia," he said, cutting his lamb with precise movements, "you're sitting on a gold mine. With the right financial strategy, you could really scale this thing, turn it into something significant." The word significant hung in the air like a challenge. For the first time, Derek was treating my business like it mattered, and despite my better judgment, I felt a small flutter of pride. Maybe I'd misjudged him. Maybe his previous dismissiveness had been his awkward way of trying not to interfere with something he didn't understand. "I've actually been doing pretty well," I admitted, taking a sip of the expensive wine Derek had chosen specifically for the evening. "Better than I expected, honestly." Derek's eyes lit up with something I mistook for approval, but now recognize as calculation. "I'd love to take a look at your books sometime," he said. "Not to interfere, just to see if there are any optimization opportunities you might be missing. Sometimes an outside perspective can spot things you're too close to see." Bethany reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Derek's helped so many people with their finances," she said, her voice carrying a note of rehearsed enthusiasm. "He could probably give you some really valuable advice." After dinner, as Bethany cleared the dishes with the efficiency of someone performing a well-practiced routine, Derek pulled me aside. His demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more serious, more intimate. "I'm glad we had this chance to talk," he said, his voice dropping to the tone he might use to discuss confidential client information. "Because I've been meaning to ask you something, and I wasn't sure how to bring it up." He explained that he and Bethany were facing a temporary cash flow issue. Nothing serious, just a timing problem with some investments that were about to pay off. They needed to bridge a gap for 60 days, maybe 90 at most. The amount he mentioned, $50,000, made my stomach drop, but he presented it so casually, like he was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. "I know it's a lot," he said, seeming to read my expression, "but I wouldn't ask if I weren't absolutely certain about the return. This investment opportunity is going to set us up for life, Anastasia. And of course, we'd pay you back with interest. Think of it as a family loan with better terms than you'd get from any bank." When I hesitated, his approach changed. He started talking about Bethany, how stressed she'd been lately, how much pressure she was under at work, how this financial security would mean everything to her peace of mind. He painted a picture of my sister struggling with anxiety and worry, all of which could be solved if I was willing to step up as the successful sister and help family when they needed it most. "She's been so proud of what you've accomplished," he said, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that felt both supportive and confining. "She talks about you all the time, about how independent and successful you've become. I think it would mean everything to her to know that success could help secure our future together." The manipulation was subtle but effective. He wasn't just asking for money. He was asking me to prove my love for Bethany, to demonstrate that my success meant something beyond my own ego. He made it sound like refusing would be selfish, like I'd be choosing my bank account over my sister's happiness. The sleepless nights started immediately after that dinner. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, Derek's words echoing in my mind like a song I couldn't shake. $50,000. Nearly everything I'd saved from 2 years of building my business. The number felt both impossibly large and strangely manageable, depending on how I looked at it. I told myself I was being practical, running through the scenarios in my head like the business owner I'd become. Derek had shown me documentation for the investment opportunity, glossy brochures for a real estate development project that promised extraordinary returns. The numbers looked legitimate, and his confidence was infectious. This wasn't some get-rich-quick scheme. It was the kind of calculated risk that serious investors made every day. But it was the calls from Bethany that ultimately broke down my resistance. They started 3 days after the dinner. Casual check-ins that gradually became more vulnerable, more desperate. She'd call in the middle of the day, her voice tight with anxiety, talking about stress at work and money worries that were keeping her awake at night. "I don't know what we're gonna do, Marley," she whispered during one particularly devastating call. "Derek's been working so hard, but everything feels so uncertain right now. I feel like I'm failing him, like I'm not contributing enough to make this work." The way she said it, like their financial struggles were somehow her fault, made my chest tighten with protective fury. This was my sister, the woman who had believed in my dreams when no one else did, and she was drowning in anxiety over something that I had the power to fix. What if I could help? I heard myself saying before I'd fully thought it through. I mean, if it's really just a short-term thing? The relief in her voice was immediate and overwhelming. "Oh, Marley, I couldn't ask you to do that. But if you really think... Derek says it's going to be such a good investment for everyone involved, and you'd get everything back plus interest in just a few months." That night, Derek called me personally. His tone was different, warmer, more respectful than I'd ever heard from him. "Bethany told me about your generous offer," he said. "I have to admit, I'm impressed. It takes real business savvy to recognize an opportunity like this." For the first time since Bethany had married him, Derek was treating me like an equal, like someone whose opinion mattered. He spent an hour on the phone with me, walking through the investment details, answering my questions with the patience of someone who genuinely valued my participation. He even offered to reduce the amount, suggesting that $30,000 might be more comfortable for me. "No," I said, surprising myself with my decisiveness. "If we're doing this, let's do it right. $50,000. The wire transfer happened on a Tuesday morning. I sat in my bank manager's office, signing forms and providing verification codes, my hands trembling slightly as I initiated the largest financial transaction of my life. The money, my security, my independence, my proof that I could succeed on my own terms, disappeared with a few keystrokes. Derek had insisted on being present for the transfer, to make sure everything goes smoothly, he said. He arrived at the bank in his best suit, carrying a leather portfolio that made him look every inch the successful financial advisor. When the transaction was complete, he shook my hand with both of his gratitude so effusive it was almost embarrassing. "You have no idea what this means to us, Anastasia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Bethany was right about you. You really are something special. This investment is going to change everything for all of us." He promised to send me weekly updates on the project's progress, and assured me that the first interest payment would arrive within 30 days. As we walked out of the bank together, he kept talking about future opportunities, about how this was just the beginning of a beautiful financial partnership between family members who really understood each other. But as I watched him drive away, the euphoria began to fade. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot, staring at the receipt that confirmed I'd just transferred $50,000 to someone who, until a week ago, had dismissed my entire business as a hobby. The paper felt surreal in my hands, like evidence of someone else's decision. I called Bethany to let her know it was done, expecting to hear relief and gratitude in her voice. Instead, she sounded distracted, almost surprised, like she'd forgotten this was happening. "Oh, that's great, Marley," she said, but her tone was flat, distant. "Derek will be so relieved. Listen, I have to run. I'm meeting a friend for lunch, and I'm already late." As I drove home, a cold knot of anxiety began forming in my stomach. Something felt wrong about the whole interaction, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way Derek had been so eager to handle every detail personally. Maybe it was Bethany's strangely muted response. Or maybe it was simply the magnitude of what I'd just done, betting my entire financial future on my brother-in-law's promises. That night, I went through my business records, calculating exactly how much runway I had left. Without my savings cushion, every month would be a tightrope walk between income and expenses. I'd given away not just money, but the security that had allowed me to take creative risks and invest in growth. I'd trusted family. And for the first time since making that decision, I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The discovery came 6 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when I was least expecting it. I'd been having lunch with my college friend Nenah at a trendy bistro downtown, trying to enjoy myself despite the constant background anxiety about my dwindling bank account. Derek's promised weekly updates had become sporadic, then non-existent, and his explanations for the delays were becoming increasingly vague. "The development permit process is taking longer than expected," he'd said during our last phone call. "You know how bureaucracy works. Everything takes twice as long as it should. But don't worry, the extra time just means bigger returns for all of us." I was trying to convince myself that real estate development really did work on unpredictable timelines when Nenah grabbed my arm mid-sentence, her eyes wide with shock. "Is that Derek?" she whispered, nodding toward the restaurant's bar area. "Your brother-in-law, Derek?" I turned to look, and there he was, unmistakably Derek, even from behind. But something was wrong with the picture. He was dressed casually, not in the business attire I'd expected for someone monitoring a major investment deal. And he wasn't alone. The woman sitting beside him was stunning in an artificial way. Platinum blonde hair, low-cut dress, the kind of manicured perfection that screamed expensive maintenance. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting possessively on his thigh, and Derek was looking at her the way he used to look at Bethany in their early dating days. "That can't be right," I murmured, but even as I said it, I knew it was him. The way he gestured with his hands when he talked, the specific tilt of his head when he leaned in to whisper something, these were mannerisms I'd observed through dozens of family dinners. Nenah and I watched in horrified fascination as Derek and his companion finished their drinks and headed toward the exit. But instead of leaving, they moved to the restaurant's attached casino lounge, a section I'd never even noticed before. Through the glass partition, I could see Derek pulling out a thick roll of cash and approaching one of the high-stakes poker tables. My blood turned to ice. The cash he was counting out looked substantial. Hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars. Money that should have been invested in the development project he'd described so convincingly. Money that was supposed to be securing Bethany's future and generating returns for my trust in him. "Should we leave?" Nenah asked, clearly sensing the disaster unfolding before us. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of Derek settling into a poker chair, the mysterious woman perched beside him like a good luck charm, both of them laughing as he placed his first bet. I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of confronting him directly or leaving in shock, I called Bethany. "Hey Marley," she answered on the third ring, her voice strained. "What's up?" "I'm downtown having lunch with Nenah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought I saw Derek at Romano's. Is he supposed to be meeting clients today?" The silence that followed lasted too long. When Bethany finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. He said he had some business meetings today. Real estate stuff. Why?" "No reason," I lied. "I just thought I'd say hi if it was him, but I wasn't sure." After I hung up, Nenah and I sat in stunned silence. The implications were staggering. Derek wasn't monitoring investments or attending business meetings. He was gambling with what appeared to be substantial amounts of money, accompanied by a woman who definitely wasn't his wife, in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. "You have to tell Bethany," Nenah said finally. "If he's cheating on her, and gambling away their money." But I couldn't finish the thought she was starting. Because if Derek was gambling, where had he gotten the money? The sick realization was creeping over me like cold water, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. I spent the rest of the weekend in a state of fevered research. I called the real estate development company Derek had shown me in those glossy brochures. The receptionist was polite but confused when I asked about investment opportunities. "I'm sorry, but we're not currently accepting private investors," she said. "Our projects are all internally funded. You might be thinking of a different company?" I tried 3 more real estate firms with similar names. None of them had heard of the specific project Derek had described. None of them matched the timeline or profit projections he'd presented so convincingly. Monday morning, I called Derek directly. My hands were shaking as I dialed, but I forced my voice to remain casual and friendly. "Hey Derek, I was just checking in on the investment," I said. "I tried to research the development company online, but I'm having trouble finding current information. Could you send me their website or maybe a contact number?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. When Derek finally responded, his smooth confidence had cracked just slightly. "Actually, Anastasia, there's been a small complication," he said. "Nothing serious, just some paperwork issues that need to be resolved. I'm handling it personally to make sure your investment is protected. You don't need to worry about contacting them directly. I'm your point person for everything." "But I'd feel more comfortable if I could speak with them myself," I pressed. "You understand, right? It's a lot of money for me." Of course," he said quickly. "Let me get you those details. I'll email them to you later today." The email never came, and when I drove past Romano's the following Saturday, Derek was there again at the same poker table with the same woman counting out another thick roll of cash. That's when I finally understood. There was no investment. There was no development project. There was only Derek, my $50,000, and a gambling addiction that was about to destroy everything. Confronting Bethany was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. I waited until the following Tuesday when I knew Derek would be at work, and drove to their house with my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd rehearsed the conversation a dozen different ways, but nothing had prepared me for what I would actually discover. Bethany answered the door looking hollow-eyed and exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled. Hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, no makeup, wearing an oversized sweater that seemed designed to hide rather than flatter. "Marley," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I wasn't expecting you. Derek's not here." "I came to see you," I said gently. "We need to talk." I could see the panic flash across her face, the way her shoulders tensed like she was preparing for impact, but she stepped aside and let me in, leading me to their pristine living room that always felt more like a showroom than a place where people actually lived. I sat beside her on the cream-colored sofa and took her hands in mine. They were ice-cold and trembling slightly. "Bethany, I know about the gambling." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her face crumpled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But then, just as quickly, the defensive walls went up. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, pulling her hands away. "Derek doesn't gamble. He's told me how dangerous that is, how it ruins families. I saw him, Beth, at Romano's, at the poker tables, with another woman, spending cash like it was nothing." I kept my voice as gentle as possible, but I watched her face register each detail like a series of small explosions. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her conviction was already cracking. "He was at work. He told me he was at work." "Where do you think he got the money I gave him?" I asked. "Because there is no real estate investment, Bethany. I've checked. The company doesn't exist the way he described it." The silence that followed was deafening. Bethany stared at her hands, and I could practically see her mind racing, connecting dots she'd been afraid to connect for months. When she finally looked up at me, tears were streaming down her face. "I knew," she whispered. "God help me, Marley. I knew something was wrong, but I was too scared to figure out what." What came next was the most painful conversation of my life. In halting, broken sentences, Bethany told me about the slow erosion of her sense of reality that had been happening since their wedding. How Derek had systematically isolated her from friends and family, always with reasonable explanations that made her feel selfish for wanting independence. "He said you were jealous of our happiness," she confessed. "He said you were trying to cause problems because you couldn't stand to see me settled and successful. I wanted to believe him because it was easier than admitting that something was terribly wrong." She told me about the financial control, how Derek had convinced her to put all her accounts in his name for tax purposes, how he monitored every purchase and questioned every expense, how he'd convinced her that her job wasn't really necessary, that it was actually causing her stress and affecting their marriage. "I haven't had access to money in 8 months, she said, her voice barely audible. "He gives me an allowance for groceries and household expenses, and I have to show him receipts for everything. When I asked about our savings account last month, he said I was being paranoid and controlling." But it was the physical abuse that broke my heart completely. Not the dramatic, obvious kind that leaves visible bruises, but the subtle, constant erosion of her autonomy. The way he would grip her arm just a little too tightly when he was guiding her through social situations. The way he would stand too close when he was angry, using his size to intimidate without technically threatening. "He's never hit me," she said quickly, as if she needed to defend him even now. "But he has this way of making me feel small, like I'm always on the verge of disappointing him. And when I do disappoint him..." She trailed off, touching her wrist unconsciously. "When you came to my apartment that night," I said, understanding flooding through me. "The fight about groceries." She nodded miserably. "He'd been losing money. A lot of money, apparently, and he was angry about everything. He said I was spending too much, that I was selfish and irresponsible. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it, just to make his point. Not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough that I understood." The picture was becoming clear, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. Derek hadn't just stolen my money, he'd used my love for Bethany as a weapon against both of us. He'd manipulated her into becoming his accomplice in the manipulation, making her feel responsible for his needs and guilty for my generosity. "He needed the money for gambling debts," she continued. "I think he owed people, scary people. He was getting phone calls at weird hours, and he would leave the house at night sometimes. When you offered to help with the investment, he said it was perfect timing, that it would solve all our problems." "But you knew it wasn't real," I said, trying to keep the accusation out of my voice. "I suspected," she admitted. "But by then I was too scared to say anything. If you found out, if you got angry, if you cut us off. Derek said you were the only family member who might ever help us, and if I ruined that relationship, we'd have nothing left." The rage that followed Bethany's confession was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It started as a cold knot in my stomach and spread through my entire body like poison, making my hands shake and my vision blur around the edges. But underneath the fury was something else, a crystalline clarity that I'd been missing for months. "We're going to destroy him," I said, my voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside me. Not physically, not emotionally, but legally, completely and utterly. Bethany looked at me with a mixture of terror and hope. "Marley, you don't understand. He's not just some guy who made a mistake. He's dangerous, and he's smart. He's covered his tracks." "Not well enough," I interrupted, "because he made one crucial error. He underestimated both of us." I spent the next 3 hours methodically documenting everything. I had Bethany write down dates, amounts, conversations, every detail she could remember about Derek's financial manipulation and abuse. I photographed the barely visible bruises on her wrist, recorded her account of his threats and control tactics, and compiled a timeline of his lies. But the real breakthrough came when I asked to see their computer. Derek, in his arrogance, had saved everything in a folder labeled Personal Finance, including detailed records of his gambling losses, correspondence with loan sharks, and most damning of all, a document outlining his plan to borrow money from family members. My name was at the top of the list, with notes about my estimated liquid assets and emotional vulnerabilities regarding family loyalty. He'd calculated exactly how much he could manipulate me for, and had already identified my cousin Marcus as his next target, with a notation about Marcus's recent inheritance from our grandmother. "He's been planning this for months," I said, screenshotting everything while Bethany watched in horrified fascination. "This isn't desperation, Beth. This is predatory behavior." We found bank statements showing thousands of dollars in gambling losses, credit card bills for expensive dinners and hotel rooms that coincided with his business meetings, and most devastatingly, a series of text messages with the blonde woman I'd seen at the casino. Her name was Crystal, and from their exchanges it was clear this wasn't just an affair. She was part of his gambling lifestyle, encouraging his bets and celebrating his wins while conveniently disappearing during his losses. "Look at this," I said, showing Bethany a particularly damning exchange where Derek bragged about scoring $50,000 from my naive sister-in-law and promised Crystal a weekend trip to Vegas to celebrate. Bethany read the messages with growing incredulity. "He called you naive," she said, her voice hollow. "After everything you've accomplished, after you trusted him with your life savings, he called you naive." The insult stung, but it also crystallized something important. Derek saw both of us as easy marks, me because of my loyalty to family, Bethany because of her isolation and financial dependence. He'd never considered that we might be strong enough to fight back together. My next call was to a lawyer. I'd worked with Patricia Chen on some business contracts for my boutique, and I knew she was exactly the kind of sharp, no-nonsense attorney who would understand the nuances of financial fraud and domestic abuse. "This is definitely prosecutable," Patricia said, after I'd emailed her the evidence. "Wire fraud, potentially theft by deception, and with the pattern of abuse toward your sister, we might be able to make a case for financial elder abuse statutes even though she's young. But more importantly, we can get emergency protective orders and freeze his assets while we build the case." "How long?" I asked. "If we move fast, we can have papers filed by tomorrow morning. The key is going to be keeping him from accessing any remaining funds or intimidating your sister. Where is he now?" Derek was at work, blissfully unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Bethany and I spent the afternoon methodically gathering evidence and preparing for what came next. We photographed documents, copied files, and created a detailed inventory of every asset in their house. But the most important thing we did was call Bethany's best friend from college, Sarah, who lived 2 states away and had been trying to reconnect with Bethany for months. Within an hour, Sarah was on the road, ready to provide Bethany with a safe place to stay while the legal proceedings played out. "I've been so worried about you," Sarah told Bethany over the phone. "Every time I tried to visit or call, Derek had some reason why it wasn't a good time. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help." As evening approached, we put our plan into motion. Bethany would confront Derek when he came home, armed with printouts of his gambling records and messages with Crystal. I would be there as backup, recording everything on my phone, ready to call the police if things escalated. The goal wasn't to give him a chance to explain or apologize. The goal was to document his response for the court case and make it clear that we knew everything. Derek walked into his house at 6:30 p.m., whistling and carrying takeout from an expensive restaurant, the kind of casual extravagance that should have been impossible given their supposed financial struggles. He stopped short when he saw me sitting in his living room next to Bethany, surrounded by papers and printouts. "What's going on?" he asked, his practiced charm faltering slightly. "Anastasia, I wasn't expecting you." "We know," Bethany said simply, holding up a bank statement that showed a $3,000 loss from the previous weekend. "We know about the gambling, about Crystal, about the lies, all of it." The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Derek's face shifted from confused concern to cold calculation to barely contained rage in the span of seconds. The mask he'd worn for so long dropped completely, revealing someone I'd never seen before. Someone dangerous. "You went through my private files," he said, his voice low and menacing. "That's illegal, Bethany. I could have you arrested." "Actually," I said, standing up and showing him my phone, which was recording everything, "fraud is illegal, Domestic abuse is illegal. Theft is illegal. Going through your wife's computer in her own house? Not so much. The courthouse steps felt like a mountain I'd been climbing for months, and finally reaching the top filled me with a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination. 3 months had passed since that confrontation in Derek's living room. 3 months of legal maneuvering, protective orders, and Derek's increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. Patricia had been right about moving fast. By the time Derek realized the scope of what we'd uncovered, his assets were frozen, and Bethany was safely staying with Sarah in another state. His initial response had been to hire an expensive lawyer and claim that everything was a misunderstanding, that the gambling was recreational, that the money I'd given him was a family loan with no formal terms, that Bethany was having some kind of breakdown. But evidence is a stubborn thing, and we had mountains of it. The defendant's own records tell the story. Patricia said during her opening statement, addressing the judge with the calm confidence of someone who knew she held all the winning cards. This wasn't a family misunderstanding or a business deal gone wrong. This was a systematic pattern of fraud, manipulation, and abuse designed to finance a gambling addiction and an extramarital relationship. Derek sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the smooth, confident man who had convinced me to wire him my life savings. His expensive suit couldn't hide the hollow look in his eyes or the way his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The past few months had not been kind to him. When I took the witness stand, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was my moment to reclaim not just my money, but my voice. I'd spent so many years letting Derek diminish my accomplishments, treating my success like a lucky accident, rather than the result of hard work and talent. Now I was going to show him exactly how capable and thorough I really was. Miss Fletcher, Patricia began, can you describe your financial situation at the time of the defendant's request for funds? I outlined my business success methodically, presenting bank statements, client contracts, and profit projections that painted a picture of a thriving enterprise. I wanted the judge to understand that this wasn't about a naive young woman being taken advantage of. This was about a predator who had targeted someone specifically because of their success and generosity. The defendant presented me with detailed documentation about a real estate investment opportunity. I continued, producing the fake brochures Derek had shown me. He assured me this was a legitimate business venture that would benefit both our families. Patricia walked me through Derek's lies, point by point. The non-existent development company, the forged investor documents, the timeline that never made sense. With each revelation, I watched Derek's lawyer become more visibly uncomfortable, realizing that his client had provided him with the same fabricated story he'd used on me. But the most powerful moment came when we presented Derek's own files, the ones he'd saved so carelessly on his computer, thinking he was too smart to ever be caught. Your Honor, Patricia said, I'd like to present Exhibit G, which are the defendant's own notes planning this fraud. She read aloud from Derek's document, including his assessment of my emotional vulnerabilities and his calculation of how much money he could extract from various family members. The courtroom was silent as she read his description of me as a reliable target due to family loyalty and hidden assets. Even Derek's lawyer looked sick, probably realizing for the first time that his client wasn't just guilty, but had documented his own guilt in meticulous detail. When Bethany testified, her quiet strength was devastating. She described the financial control, the isolation, the subtle threats that had made her complicit in Derek's scheme. She showed the court photos of the bruises on her wrist and explained how Derek had used her love for me as a weapon against both of us. He told me that if I didn't help convince Anastasia to invest, we would lose our house, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. He said it was my responsibility as his wife to support him, and that if I really loved my sister, I would help secure our family's financial future. Derek's cross-examination of Bethany was brutal to watch, but it backfired spectacularly. His lawyer tried to paint her as an unstable wife making accusations to cover her own financial irresponsibility, but Bethany remained composed and factual. Every question just gave her another opportunity to provide more damning details about Derek's behavior. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. Guilty on all counts of wire fraud and theft by deception. Guilty of financial abuse, 3 years in prison, full restitution including interest and court costs, and a permanent restraining order protecting both Bethany and me. As Derek was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time. The expression on his face wasn't remorse or shame. It was pure, impotent rage that his carefully laid plans had been destroyed by the 2 women he'd underestimated most. Walking out of that courthouse felt like emerging from a cave I'd been trapped in for months, blinking in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright and clean. But the real revelation wasn't Derek's conviction. It was seeing who had been standing beside me throughout the entire ordeal. Sarah had driven 8 hours from her home to be there for the verdict, taking time off work she couldn't afford to lose just to support someone she'd barely spoken to in years. My business mentor Elena had closed her shop early to sit in the gallery, her weathered hands folded in quiet solidarity. Even Nenah had rearranged her schedule to be there, bringing coffee and tissues and the kind of unwavering friendship I'd forgotten existed. These weren't people bound to me by blood or obligation. They were people who had chosen to show up because they believed in justice, because they cared about me as a person, not as a family member who could be useful or manipulated. The contrast to my biological family's response was stark and telling. My parents had been conspicuously absent from the trial. When I'd called to tell them about Derek's arrest, my mother's first concern hadn't been for Bethany's safety or my stolen money. It was about what people would think and how this would affect the family's reputation. "Couldn't you have handled this privately?" she'd asked, her voice tight with embarrassment. "Did you really need to drag the courts into a family matter?" My father's reaction had been even worse. He'd suggested that I was partially responsible for what had happened, that I should have been more careful about flashing money around and making myself a target. According to him, the real tragedy wasn't Derek's crimes, but the way I'd torn the family apart by refusing to handle things quietly. Derek made mistakes, he'd said during one particularly painful phone call. But families forgive. Families work things out together. What you're doing is vindictive, Anastasia. It's not who we raised you to be. The accusation had stung at first, but now, watching my chosen family celebrate this victory with me, I understood something fundamental. The people who truly loved me weren't asking me to minimize my pain or protect my abuser's reputation. They were angry on my behalf. They wanted justice for what had been done to me. "I'm so proud of you," Elena said as we stood on the courthouse steps, her arm around my shoulders in a way that felt protective rather than possessive. It took incredible courage to stand up to him like that. And look what you accomplished. You not only got your money back, you probably saved other people from becoming his next victims. Elena was right. During the investigation, we'd discovered that Derek had been researching several of my cousins, building psychological profiles and financial assessments just like he'd done with me. My cousin Marcus, who had inherited money from our grandmother, had actually received a call from Derek just days before his arrest. Something about a time-sensitive investment opportunity that required quick action. "You stopped a predator," Patricia told me as we reviewed the final settlement documents. "This wasn't just about your $50,000. This was about breaking a pattern that could have destroyed multiple families." But the most meaningful moment came later that evening, when Bethany and I sat together in my apartment, really together, without Derek's presence poisoning the air between us. She looked different than she had in months, lighter, somehow, like she'd been carrying a weight that had finally been lifted. "I keep waiting for the guilt to hit," she said, curling up on my couch with a cup of tea. "Society tells us that wives should stand by their husbands, that family loyalty means protecting each other no matter what. But all I feel is relief." "That's because you're free," I told her. "For the first time in years, you're making decisions based on what's right, not what Derek wants you to think is right." Bethany had been staying with Sarah for the past month, rediscovering parts of herself that had been systematically erased during her marriage. She'd started therapy, opened her own bank account, and was even considering going back to school to finish the degree she'd abandoned when Derek convinced her that education was wasted on someone who was destined to be a wife and mother. "Sarah keeps telling me I'm brave," Bethany said with a rueful laugh. "But I don't feel brave. I feel like I've been sleepwalking for 2 years, and I'm just now waking up." "Waking up is brave," I replied, "especially when the dream was designed to keep you unconscious." That night, as we sat together talking until nearly dawn, I realized something profound about the difference between chosen family and biological family. Chosen family sees you clearly and loves what they see. They don't try to reshape you into someone more convenient or manageable. They don't demand loyalty that requires you to betray yourself. My parents had raised me to believe that family came first, always, regardless of the cost to individual members. But Derek had taught me that unconditional loyalty is just another word for unconditional vulnerability. The people who truly deserve your trust are the ones who would never ask you to choose between their comfort and your safety. As Bethany fell asleep on my couch, finally peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before her wedding, I made myself a promise. I would never again apologize for protecting myself. I would never again minimize my success to make other people comfortable, and I would never again confuse obligation with love. Rebuilding my business after Derek's theft was like learning to walk again after a devastating injury. I had the settlement money, every penny returned with interest and legal fees, but more importantly, I had something I'd never possessed before: absolute clarity about who I was and what I was capable of achieving. The first challenge was practical. During the months consumed by legal proceedings, I'd been forced to put my boutique operations on hold. Clients had been understanding, but understandably concerned, and some had moved on to other designers. My carefully cultivated waiting list had dwindled to a handful of loyal customers who were willing to wait indefinitely for my return. But instead of seeing this as a setback, I recognized it as an opportunity for rebirth. "You're different," Elena observed during one of our mentor sessions in her cluttered office above her vintage clothing shop. "More focused. Like you've shed some skin that was never really yours to begin with." She was right. The woman who had timidly downplayed her success at family dinners was gone, replaced by someone who understood that false modesty was just another form of self-betrayal. I'd learned the hard way that hiding your light doesn't protect you from people who want to steal it. It just makes you an easier target. My new approach was radically transparent. I created a detailed blog post about the experience, obviously without naming Derek or revealing details that could compromise the legal case, but honestly discussing the reality of running a small business and the vulnerabilities that predators exploit. The response was overwhelming. "I had no idea you were going through all of this," wrote one of my longtime clients. "Your strength in sharing this story just makes me respect your work even more. When you're ready to take orders again, I'd like to commission 3 pieces." The post went viral in the small business community, shared by entrepreneurs who recognized the universal fear of being taken advantage of by people who present themselves as supporters. Within a week, I had interview requests from business podcasts, invitations to speak at entrepreneurship conferences, and most surprisingly, inquiries from other designers who wanted to collaborate rather than compete. "Vulnerability is magnetic," explained Dr. Rebecca Torres, the therapist Bethany had recommended, and who had become an unexpected source of business wisdom. "When you're authentic about your struggles, you give other people permission to be authentic about theirs. That creates the kind of connection that no marketing strategy can manufacture." I took this lesson to heart in redesigning my entire business model. Instead of operating as a solo designer trying to manage every aspect of production, I built a network of collaborators, seamstresses who specialized in particular techniques, fabric sourcing experts, even a business manager who handled the financial details I'd previously guarded so jealously. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek's betrayal had taught me that the wrong kind of trust could be devastating. But it had also shown me that the right kind of trust was essential for growth. The difference was choosing partners based on competence and character, rather than family obligation or emotional manipulation. My new studio space reflected this philosophy. Instead of hiding my success in a spare bedroom, I rented a bright, open loft in the Arts District, with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased my work to anyone walking by. I hired 2 apprentice designers and created an internship program for fashion students who couldn't afford traditional design school. "You're building an empire," Nenah observed during the studio's opening celebration, watching me move confidently between clusters of clients, collaborators, and media representatives. "But more than that, you're building it on your own terms." The business metrics supported her observation. Within 6 months of reopening, I'd not only recovered my previous client base, but expanded it by 200%. The trauma narrative had resonated beyond the fashion world, attracting customers who valued the story behind the designs as much as the craftsmanship itself. But the most significant change wasn't in my revenue or recognition, it was in my relationship with money itself. Derek's theft had forced me to examine my complicated feelings about financial success, the guilt and fear that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation in the first place. I started working with a financial advisor, not because I couldn't manage my own money, but because having a professional perspective helped me make decisions based on logic rather than emotion. I diversified my investments, created multiple revenue streams, and most importantly, built financial safeguards that would make it impossible for anyone to access my assets without multiple layers of verification. "Wealth isn't just about having money," my advisor explained during one of our quarterly reviews. "It's about having systems that protect and grow that money, regardless of what happens in your personal relationships." This lesson extended beyond finances into every aspect of my business. I created contracts that protected my intellectual property, established clear boundaries with clients about payment terms and design ownership, and built a legal relationship with Patricia that meant any future disputes could be handled swiftly and professionally. The woman who had once apologized for her success was gone, replaced by someone who understood that success without boundaries is just an invitation for exploitation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, handwritten on lavender stationery in the careful script of someone who'd thought long and hard about every word. It was from a woman named Jennifer in Oregon who had read my blog post about financial manipulation and recognized her own story in mine. "My husband convinced me to invest my inheritance in his business venture," she wrote. "When I asked questions about the timeline, he said I was being unsupportive and paranoid. Reading your story made me realize that my doubts weren't paranoia. They were instincts trying to protect me. Thank you for giving me permission to trust myself again." Jennifer's letter was the first of dozens. Women from across the country reached out, sharing their own experiences of financial abuse, family manipulation, and the crushing isolation that comes with being betrayed by someone you're supposed to trust. Each story was different in its details but identical in its emotional architecture. The slow erosion of self-trust, the weaponization of love and loyalty, the devastating realization that the person you'd tried hardest to help was the one determined to destroy you. I started responding to every letter personally, but quickly realized that individual support wasn't enough. These women needed community, resources, and most importantly, they needed to understand that they weren't alone in their experiences. That's how the Fletcher Foundation was born. Not as a grand philanthropic gesture, but as a practical response to an urgent need I'd discovered by accident. "You're creating something revolutionary," said Maria Santos, the nonprofit consultant I'd hired to help structure the foundation properly. "Most domestic violence resources focus on physical abuse, and most financial fraud resources focus on stranger scams. You're addressing the intersection, financial abuse within intimate relationships, and that's desperately needed." The Foundation's mission was simple: provide practical support and resources for women recovering from financial manipulation and abuse. We offered everything from legal referrals and financial planning services to therapeutic support groups and emergency funds for women trying to escape controlling situations. But the heart of the Foundation was something more intangible: the creation of a chosen family network that could replace the biological families who had failed to protect or support these women. Bethany became our first success story and our most passionate advocate. 6 months after Derek's conviction, she'd not only rebuilt her own life, but was using her experience to help other women recognize the warning signs she'd missed. She led support groups, spoke at conferences about financial abuse in marriage, and had started pursuing a degree in social work with a specialization in domestic violence intervention. "I spent 2 years feeling like I was crazy," she told a room full of survivors at one of our monthly meetings. "Derek convinced me that my concerns were unreasonable, that my need for financial independence was selfish, that my desire to maintain relationships outside our marriage was threatening. But sitting in this room, listening to all of your stories, I understand that these weren't personal failures. These were tactics from a playbook that abusers use over and over again." The meetings became the Foundation's most powerful offering. Women would arrive isolated and ashamed, convinced they were the only ones stupid enough to fall for such obvious manipulation. They would leave connected to a network of survivors who understood exactly what they'd endured and exactly how strong they'd had to be to survive it. Elena donated space above her shop for our meetings, and soon we outgrew that and moved to a community center. Then we outgrew that and rented our own building. Each expansion brought new opportunities to help more women, but also new responsibilities that I embraced with the same intensity I'd once brought to perfecting a difficult seam. The Foundation introduced me to women like Dr. Patricia Kim, a financial therapist who specialized in helping abuse survivors rebuild their relationship with money, like Sarah Chen, a tech entrepreneur who created a secure app for documenting abuse evidence, like Judge Margaret Thompson, who understood the legal complexities of financial abuse cases and helped us navigate the system more effectively. These weren't casual acquaintances or networking contacts. They were women who had chosen to dedicate their professional lives to protecting and empowering other women. They became my advisors, my collaborators, and ultimately, my truest family. "Blood doesn't make family," I told a group of new Foundation clients during one of our orientation sessions. "Choice makes family. Consistency makes family. The willingness to show up for each other, especially when it's difficult or inconvenient, that's what creates real family bonds." My biological parents still struggled to understand this concept. They attended Foundation events occasionally, more out of social obligation than genuine support, and my mother had never stopped suggesting that I was dwelling on the past rather than moving forward constructively. But I'd learned to see their limitations with compassion rather than anger. They were products of a generation that prioritized family unity over individual safety, that valued loyalty over justice. They couldn't understand my choices because they'd never been forced to choose between family harmony and personal survival. My chosen family, however, understood completely. We'd all made the same difficult choice, to prioritize truth over comfort, safety over convenience, authentic connection over obligatory relationships. We'd all learned that the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal comes at a personal cost. 5 years later, I stood in my flagship boutique's mirror-lined fitting room, watching a bride-to-be try on the custom gown I'd designed for her wedding. Her name was Amanda, and she'd come to me not because she needed the most expensive dress or the most elaborate design, but because she wanted something that would make her feel authentically herself on the most important day of her life. "It's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she turned to see herself from every angle. "I feel like the best version of myself, like the woman I've always wanted to." This was why I did what I did. Not for the magazine features or the industry recognition, though those had come in abundance. Not for the financial success, though the boutique now employed 12 people and had a waiting list that stretched 8 months out. I did it for moments like this, when a woman looked in the mirror and saw not just beautiful clothing, but her own power reflected back at her. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek's betrayal had led me to this place of absolute clarity about my purpose and worth. His attempt to steal my success had forced me to examine why I'd been so willing to hide that success in the first place, and that examination had revealed wounds much deeper than his theft. You know what I realized? I told Dr. Torres during one of our sessions, which had evolved from trauma recovery to personal growth maintenance. I was never really hiding my success from Derek or my family. I was hiding it from myself. I was so afraid of being seen as arrogant or selfish that I made myself small, and that made me vulnerable. The woman I'd become was someone my younger self would hardly recognize. I spoke at business conferences about entrepreneurship and financial independence. I appeared on podcasts discussing the intersection of domestic violence and economic abuse. I'd even been featured in Forbes as one of the 30 under 30 social entrepreneurs for my work with the foundation. But the real transformation wasn't external. It was the quiet confidence that came from knowing with absolute certainty that my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or validation. My relationship with my biological family had settled into a peaceful détente. My parents attended major events, foundation galas, boutique openings, and we maintained cordial contact, but the desperate need for their approval had evaporated completely. They were who they were, with their own limitations and fears, and I no longer needed them to be different in order for me to be whole. Bethany and I had grown closer than we'd ever been, bonded not just by shared trauma, but by the mutual respect that comes from watching someone rebuild their life with courage and integrity. She'd graduated with her social work degree and was now the foundation's program director, using her experience to help other women navigate the complex intersection of family loyalty and personal safety. "Sometimes I think Derek did us a favor," she said during one of our weekly sister dinners. A tradition we'd reinstated in my apartment, where Derek's presence could never again poison the atmosphere. Obviously, I wish it hadn't happened, but it forced us both to grow up in ways we might never have otherwise. The foundation had expanded beyond my wildest dreams, now operating in 12 cities, with plans for national expansion. We'd helped over 500 women escape financial abuse, recover stolen assets, and rebuild their economic independence. Each success story felt like a small act of resistance against the Dereks of the world, men who saw women's trust and generosity as weaknesses to exploit rather than strengths to honor. But my proudest achievement was simpler and more personal. I'd learned to see myself clearly, not through the distorted lens of other people's expectations or limitations, but through my own eyes. I knew my strengths and weaknesses, my values and boundaries, my capacity for love and my need for respect. I no longer needed external validation to know I was successful. I no longer needed family approval to know I was worthy of love. I no longer needed romantic partnership to know I was complete. Standing in that fitting room, watching Amanda discover her own power in the dress I'd created, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work that aligns perfectly with your values. This was success on my own terms, using my talents to empower other women, building a business that reflected my values, creating a life that felt authentic and purposeful. Derek had tried to steal my money, but inadvertently he'd given me something far more valuable: the unshakable knowledge that my worth came from within, and that no one could take that away from me unless I let them. The phone buzzed with a text from my latest client, asking about timeline for her order. I smiled as I typed back, no longer apologizing for my success or minimizing my expertise. I was Anastasia Fletcher, master designer, business owner, foundation founder, and survivor. And I was finally, completely, unshakably proud of exactly who I had become. Have you ever found yourself shrinking your dreams to fit other people's comfort zones? Have you ever apologized for your success or hidden your achievements because you were afraid of making waves? I used to think that loyalty meant sacrifice, that being a good sister, daughter, or family member required me to make myself smaller so others could feel bigger. But Derek's betrayal taught me that real love doesn't ask you to diminish yourself. Real love celebrates your growth and protects your shine. If you're reading this and recognizing yourself in my story, I want you to know something. Your instincts are valid. Your success is earned. Your boundaries are necessary. And anyone who asks you to choose between their comfort and your safety isn't someone who deserves your loyalty. Share your story in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family harmony and personal truth? How did you find the courage to trust yourself over the people who claimed to know what was best for you? Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If my journey resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to define success on their own terms. Sometimes the most radical thing we can do is refuse to make ourselves small for other people's comfort. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to be successful, and you don't need anyone's approval to be proud of what you've built. Your worth isn't up for debate, and your dreams aren't too big. Trust yourself, protect your peace, and never, ever apologize for shining as brightly as you were meant to shine.